a task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Report. Content warning. Report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence. Terror Chapter 3. Introduction. Enslavement was followed by decades of violence and intimidation intended to subordinate African Americans across the United States. Racial terror, and lynchings in particular, pervaded every aspect of pre- and post-enslavement Black life. African Americans faced threats of violence when they tried to vote, when they tried to buy homes in white neighborhoods, when they tried to swim in public pools, and when they made progress through the courts or in legislation. Led and joined by prominent members of society, and enabled by government officials, ordinary citizens terrorized African Americans to preserve a caste system that kept African Americans from building the same wealth and political influence as white Americans. Racial terror also continued the generational trauma that began during enslavement. Mob violence, and other forms of racial terror are no longer socially acceptable. The threat and legacy of terror continue to haunt Black communities. Such violence has found a modern form in extrajudicial killings of African Americans by police and vigilantes. Racial terror targeted at successful African Americans has contributed to the present wealth gap between Black and white Americans. Today, the monitoring of polling places by white supremacist groups evokes a history of violent suppression of Black voters. This chapter chronicles the racial terror inflicted on African Americans, including in California, and the lasting impact of racial terror. This chapter addresses the overarching purpose of racial terror as a method of social control. This chapter will identify the perpetrators of racial terror, most notably the Ku Klux Klan (KKK), and their objective of preserving their dominance in society. The chapter pays special attention to the KKK's history and spread in California. Third, this chapter will discuss the various forms of racial terror, such as lynching, mob violence, and sexual violence. The chapter also identifies numerous instances of racial terror in California. This chapter shows how racial terror allowed white Americans to politically, economically, and socially subordinate African Americans. This chapter will discuss the consequences of racial terror, such as intergenerational trauma and the racial wealth gap, which continue to this day. Courtesy of Jack Benton, archive photos via Getty Images. Klan members, circa 1920-95. Chapter 3 Racial Terror. 2. Objectives of racial terror: social, political, and economic oppression. The practice of racial terror began during enslavement and has continued ever since, developing through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the 20th century, and today. Key to understanding the widespread use of racial terror is recognizing how its perpetrators sought to oppress African Americans socially, psychologically, politically, and economically in order to maintain a racial hierarchy. Journalist Isabel Wilkerson argues, a caste system is a social hierarchy created by people in a community that separates groups of human beings based on ancestry, skin color, or other characteristics that cannot be changed. Caste system. One group of human beings is believed to be superior, while other groups are believed to be inferior and treated as less than human. 11. In the racially ordered caste system of the United States, white people occupy this higher social position. Pillar holding up the American racial caste system is the use of physical and psychological terror, which serves to control African Americans and prevent resistance. For this caste system to continue functioning, the rest of society, including government officials, only need to look the other way. For state and local government officials, this is a neglect of their duty to protect. In America, for centuries, the perpetrators of racial terror have rarely been held accountable for their violence, and so they have continued to enforce their dominant caste position. 16. Of racial terror in America started during enslavement, when whipping was a tool to control enslaved people and break their spirit. Enslavers openly publicized their use of violence. When an enslaved person sought freedom by escaping, enslavers sometimes turned to torture, or invited others to kill the freedom seeker. White enslavers could thus use a public display of violence to demonstrate their power over black enslaved persons, scare enslaved persons into submission, and uphold the institution of enslavement. 20. Of the enslaved were also violently suppressed. 21. For example, white officials purportedly covered an extensive conspiracy of insurrection in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822. 22. The enslaved, led by the free black carpenter Denmark Vesey, allegedly plotted to take over the city and kill all of its white residents, including women and children. 23. After the discovery of the alleged conspiracy, Vesey was arrested, along with dozens of enslaved persons. 4. Confessions and testimony against the alleged conspirators were procured in at least some instances by coercion and torture. 25. The prosecution had no physical evidence to support its case. 6. In the end, Vesey and 34 others were executed, although no insurrection ever occurred and no white person was actually killed. 27. Indeed, there is significant doubt as to whether any such insurrection plot ever existed. 8. Then Governor of South Carolina Thomas Bennett condemned the trial as hasty and unreliable. His brother-in-law, Supreme Court Justice William Johnson, described the proceedings as perjury and legal murder. 29. After the formal end of enslavement, black Southerners began to gain political and economic influence. Discussed in Chapter 2 on enslavement, the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 gave voting rights to African Americans, and following the law's enactment, black voter turnout reached nearly 90% in many jurisdictions. During Reconstruction, approximately 2,000 black men held a public office, including 600 black state legislators, 18 black state executive officials, 16 black representatives elected to Congress, and 2 of the nation's first black senators. Nearly 20% of all public officials in the South were black between 1870 and 1876. 2. In spite of violence and other obstacles, black Southerners began owning land, particularly in the Upper South Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Black land ownership grew to such an extent that by 1910, nearly half of the black farmers in the Upper South owned land. 34. In addition, black literacy rates surged from approximately 20% in 1870 to approximately 70% in 1910. 35. 1876, partially as a result of a disputed presidential election, Reconstruction came to an end. Exchange for Democrats not blocking the certification of Republican Rutherford B. Hayes as president, Hayes and other Republicans agreed to remove federal troops from key locations of political conflict in the South. 36. With the For centuries, the perpetrators of racial terror have rarely been held accountable for their violence, and so they have continued to enforce their dominant caste position. 6. 3. Racial terror. End of Reconstruction. Supporters of white supremacy returned to power. 37. They regained political, social, and economic control, and prevented African Americans from voting. After federal troops no longer had a strong presence in the South, white Southerners intensified the violent oppression of African Americans. 9. As shown in detail below, racial terror took on many forms throughout American history: lynchings, massacres, intimidation, murders, beatings, and police killings. A. Extrajudicial killings of African Americans by police and vigilantes represent a modern form of racial terror. Americans feared that newly empowered African Americans would destroy the racial hierarchy. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacists beat, burned, and killed African Americans. Terror pervaded every aspect of Southern life and had a devastating effect on the psyche of African Americans. 3. The perpetrators' principal goal was to use violence and intimidation to prevent black people from voting, achieving equality. 44. And amassing political and economic power. For example, white supremacists murdered black political activists in the 1873 Colfax Massacre and black military members in the 1876 Hamburg Massacre. 6. The Supreme Court's 1876 decision in United States versus Cruikshank enabled such violence to continue by making it more difficult to prosecute. 7. According to the then governor Louisiana, Cruikshank established the principle that hereafter no white man could be punished for killing a Negro. Supremacists often targeted the greatest perceived threats to the caste system: black political, economic, social activities, and those perceived to be accomplished members of the black community. At the end of Reconstruction, government actors in the South did little to correct the view that black people did not deserve human dignity or basic legal and political rights. 49. Across the country, white people often rejected the idea that African Americans were equal to white Americans. 50. And used violence to preserve America's racial caste system. 1. Explained below, racial terror advanced three main goals: maintaining the superior social position of white people, destroying black economic competition, and stealing black wealth. Limiting the political influence of black people while advancing white supremacy through government offices. Perpetrators of terror. Private citizens, government support. Throughout American history, from enslavement to the present day, private citizens and government actors have perpetrated and enabled racial terror. People committed heinous acts of violence, while others did nothing, watched, or obstructed investigations. Meanwhile, government officials often did nothing to prevent or prosecute racial terror, and sometimes encouraged or assisted the perpetrators. Indeed, white supremacists and Ku Klux Klan members have held positions in all levels of American government. 54. Numerous perpetrators of racial terror. The Ku Klux Klan was especially prominent. KKK is not the only hate group in American history, and oftentimes racial violence was and is committed by individuals unassociated with an organized group. 5. But because the KKK has been active and influential for several intervals during its long history, it is centrally important. History of racial terror in the United States. 56. Throughout its history, the Klan has targeted members of all racial groups, as well as Jews, Catholics, and others, but its origins were anti-black. 57. KKK was especially powerful during three periods. The first iteration of the KKK lasted from 1866 until 1869. Several decades of dormancy. The second iteration of the KKK lasted from 1915 until about 1944. The third version of the KKK arose in the 1950s and 1960s and went into decline in the 1980s. Iterations will be discussed in greater detail below. Of the Ku Klux Klan. Iteration of the Ku Klux Klan took shape in early 1866, during Reconstruction, and formally disbanded in 1869. 58. After the Civil War ended, many white. According to the then governor of Louisiana, Cruikshank, established the principle that hereafter no white man could be punished for killing a Negro. 7. 3. Racial terror. Presented Reconstruction and its policies, which threatened their superiority. 59. Reconstruction policies led to social, political, and economic gains by formerly enslaved people. This time, the KKK emerged to oppose Reconstruction, led by former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest and a group of Confederate veterans in Pulaski, Tennessee. This first version of the KKK consisted of ex-Confederates and other white Southerners, and it was tacitly supported by most white Southerners. 52. Their hooded costumes were intended to represent the ghosts of Confederate soldiers and evoke the history of slave patrols. 63. Their hoods also allowed KKK members to remain unarmed. They spread fear and violence. 64. In order to re-exert control over the black labor force and maintain white supremacy, the KKK used fear tactics and violence, such as robbery, rape, arson, and murder. 65. The KKK was effective at targeting its violence and intimidation tactics at black voters, including hanging and beating black officeholders. 66 It is unknown how many black people were killed by white supremacists during Reconstruction, though it is estimated to be in the high thousands, if not tens of thousands. 67. 1860s, the KKK began to decline as it succumbed to infighting and increased federal scrutiny. 68 The Federal Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, in conjunction with federal policing, helped weaken the KKK. 9 When the KKK formally disbanded by the end of Reconstruction, the KKK had achieved its objectives, as white Southerners were able to openly revive many aspects of life during enslavement. Having effectively intimidated and suppressed black voters, and without the presence of federal troops to protect black voters, white Southerners were successful in retaking control of state governments. 71 Once in control, white passed laws to take away the rights that black Southerners had gained during Reconstruction. 72 It also became less necessary to wear a mask to commit violent crimes against African Americans, as public lynching became an openly accepted part of Southern culture and was tolerated by law enforcement. 73 State and local governments often looked the other way or supported the KKK. Although state governments laws in response to the KKK's violence, these laws were seldom locally enforced. 4 Sheriffs, prosecutors, local witnesses, and jurors were sympathetic to white supremacy or afraid of retaliation. 75 Some attacks were even led by local police. 76 Thus, few KKK members ever went to prison for their crimes. 77 And while the federal enforcement acts of the early 1870s helped lead to the dissolution of the KKK, the Supreme Court largely nullified the enforcement acts with its 1876 decision in United States v. Cruikshank, which hindered federal prosecutions and enabled white supremacist violence. 78 Iteration of the Ku Klux Klan The second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan began in 1915, continued through the late 1920s and 1930s, and disbanded by 1944. 9 After the end of Reconstruction, the KKK remained dormant until 1915, when the California film industry played a unique role in reviving the KKK. Celebrated filmmaker D.W. released The Birth of a Nation, which was based on Thomas Dixon's novel The Klansman. He made in and around Los Angeles, The Birth of a Nation is acknowledged both as one of the most pioneering and most racist films in cinematic history. President Woodrow Wilson praised The Birth of a Nation and showed the film at the White House, a federal government endorsement of white supremacy and anti-blackness. 82. In writing The Klansman, Dixon openly wished to depict the suffering of white Southerners during Reconstruction and to advocate white supremacy. 3. The Birth of a known how many black people were killed by white supremacists during Reconstruction, though it is estimated to be in the high thousands, if not tens of thousands. Crowds searching for a Negro, Chicago, 1922. C. of Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the New York Public Library. 98. 3. Racial terror. Recognized as historically inaccurate racist propaganda, adhered closely to the source material's racism. Or for instance, the film portrayed lynching as rightful retribution against a black man accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. 5. Griffith would later say that the heroic depiction of the KKK coming to rescue the South from black advancement during Reconstruction was needed to serve the purpose. 6. Nation was a nationwide blockbuster, and its popularity led directly to the KKK's revival just months after its release. During a 5-year national roadshow of the film from 1915 to 1919, a scholar found that the film incited significant increases in racial violence. Counties where the film was shown were 5 times more likely to have a lynching or race riot, and 3 times more likely to have a KKK chapter after the movie's arrival. 9. As a result of this surge in recruitment, there were 4 to 5 million KKK members by the mid-1920s. The film remained a KKK recruiting tool for decades. 91. First iteration of the KKK, this version had a broader geographic base of support beyond the South, including in California. 92 This second version of the KKK was generally considered to be less violent, as it focused on gaining influence through the political process. 93 In whippings and tar and feather raids. 6 According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the KKK also used D-acid to brand the letters KKK on the foreheads of African Americans, Jews, and others whom the KKK considered to be anti-American. 7 In the mid-1920s, the KKK launched a terror campaign including lynchings, shootings, and whippings against African Americans, Jews, Catholics, Mexicans, and other immigrant groups. 98 After a series of scandals, infighting, and a change in public perception of its image, the second iteration of the KKK lost credibility, and its membership declined in the late 1920s and 1930s. 9 Third iteration of the Ku Klux Klan and hate groups. Today, a third version of the Ku Klux Klan arose in the 1950s and 1960s. 100 While the KKK still exists today, it has been in decline since the late 1980s. 101 This time, the KKK returned to its anti-black roots to counter the social and political gains sought by the civil rights movement. 102 This version of the KKK was particularly violent against African Americans and civil rights workers in the South. 3 For example, in 1963, the KKK detonated a bomb at a Birmingham Baptist church that killed 4 black girls and injured several more. 104 dollars award after one of the perpetrators admitted he was carrying out an organization-wide directive to harass, intimidate, and murder black people. 107. Essential part of the success of the KKK is that their actions and ethos were sanctioned by white society, a recurring theme in the history of racial terror. 108 Rarely did the perpetrators face punishment, as ministers, editors, sheriffs, police officers, judges, and elected officials ignored or participated in the violence. 9 Having supporters and members in prominent positions of power allowed the KKK to act with impunity. 10 For example, the KKK was able to commit lynchings in front of a public audience and leave bodies on display, all without intervention by law enforcement. 11 Witnesses often obstructed any investigation or prosecution for these acts by refusing to give information. 112 Police not only refused to intervene, but also gave the KKK information about potential targets. 113 Thus, where the KKK led, white society followed, participated, and looked on. While the KKK no longer enjoys the degree of socio-political power it once held, 114 contemporary white supremacist groups have taken up the KKK's mantle to threaten the dignified existence of African Americans and others. 2017 White Nationalist Rally in Charlottesville, 115 The Proud Boys, 116 and a 2021 White Lives Matter rally in Orange County 117 have variously invoked the symbols, propaganda, and ideology of the KKK. Having supporters and members in prominent positions of power allowed the KKK to act with impunity. Example, the KKK was able to commit lynchings in front of a public audience and leave bodies on display, all without intervention by law enforcement. 9. 3. Racial terror. California. Racial terror nor the Ku Klux Klan were confined to the South. 118 During Reconstruction, the federal government did not send troops to California as a non-slave state. 19 This allowed white supremacy groups to flourish in the West. 120 The Western KKK complemented Southern counterparts by violently asserting white superiority against the perceived threat of racial outsiders. 121 as the black population in California was relatively small at the time, the KKK and other hate groups mainly terrorized Chinese communities. 22. In the second iteration of the KKK, California became a strong Klan state, with a sizable and violent Klan resurgence in the 1920s. 23 Shortly after the release of The Birth of a Nation, the KKK emerged in San Francisco, establishing a KKK presence in California for the first time. 24 KKK chapters in Los Angeles, Oakland, Fresno, Riverside, Sacramento, Anaheim, and San Jose soon followed. 125. KKK's national magazine, Imperial Nighthawk, shows that California ranked 11th out of all 48 states in terms of the number of KKK events held between March 1923 and November 1924. 126 By hosting 89 events in the 20-month period, California even outranked the old enslavement states of Mississippi, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Tennessee. 127. California's KKK consisted of prominent individuals who held positions in civil leadership and police departments. 128 Its members were largely middle-class, educated Protestants who, in socioeconomic terms, were not much different from their neighbors. 29 These KKK members registered to vote in higher percentages than non-members, joined civic organizations like the Chamber of Commerce and Rotary Club, and sought political power by running for elected office or supporting candidates who sympathized with the KKK. 130. California KKK exerted significant political influence in the 1920s, winning seats on city councils, gaining control of the press and airwaves in some towns, and other public officials. 131 In 1922, for example, Democrat Thomas Lee Woolwine lost his bid for governor, suggesting that his fight against the KKK was a political liability. 132 The KKK backed winning candidate Republican Friend Richardson, who was believed to have been a KKK member, and which he never denied. 33. KKK declined on a national scale in the 1930s with the Great Depression, and after the 1925 trial and conviction of the KKK's then leader, California's KKK remained active through the 1940s and into the 1950s. 34 As detailed below, the KKK had branches, and spread terror, throughout the state, and exercised significant power in local governments. The Ku Klux Klan in Southern California. Los Angeles was the epicenter of Ku Klux Klan activity in California. 135 Prominent and numerous city government. 50 members of the Ku Klux Klan held a cross-burning ceremony on a small ranch outside of Sacramento. Guards wearing Klan outfits and helmets surrounded the ranch, while members made speeches and paraded around the burning cross. 1980. Via VETTMANN via Getty Images. 1922. For example, Democrat Thomas Lee Woolwine lost his bid for California governor, suggesting that his fight against the KKK was a political liability. KKK-backed winning candidate Republican Friend Richardson, who was believed to have been a KKK member, and which he never denied. 100. 3. Racial terror. These were KKK members or had KKK ties, including the mayor, district attorneys, and police officers. 136 Due to aggressive recruitment efforts beginning in 1921, several KKK branches formed in Los Angeles. 137 KKK chapters also formed in the nearby communities of Santa Monica, Huntington Park, Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach, Long Beach, Glendale, San Pedro, and Anaheim. 138. 1920s, the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, was a den of corruption that was infiltrated with KKK members who practiced retaliatory policing in the city's black neighborhoods. 139 inches In speaking to the police, you are frequently talking to the Klan, warned the Eagle, a black Los Angeles newspaper. 140 Los Angeles Deputy Sheriff Nathan Baker regularly recruited KKK members to the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, and was thought to be a member of the KKK himself. 141. 22, 1922, more than 100 armed and hooded Klansmen broke into the Inglewood home of Spanish immigrants. 142, the Klansmen forced the couple's 2 teenage daughters to disrobe and ransack the house. 143, the Klansmen then brutally beat, bound, and gagged the father and his brother, dragged them to a car, and dumped them 6 miles away. 144, 37 Klansmen were indicted for the Inglewood raid, but in a trial that the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People (NAACP) called a farce, all were acquitted. 145 prompted an investigation by the district attorney, who obtained membership lists revealing that the KKK had infiltrated all levels of state and local government. 146 There were 3,000 KKK members in Los Angeles County, over 1,000 in the city limits, and 3 KKK members on the district attorney's own staff. 147 LAPD Chief Louis D. Oakes and County Sheriff William I. Traeger were also identified as members. 148 law enforcement from nearly every city in California appeared on the list, including 25 San Francisco police officers. 149 After the Inglewood raid exposed the breadth of KKK membership, and after the legislature passed an anti-KKK bill, the KKK still proceeded to hold 9 events in Los Angeles between March 1923 and April 1924. 150 The raid and its aftermath inspired KKK members and caused the KKK to redouble its efforts. 151 In 1929, KKK supporters helped elect John C. Porter, who had a past with the KKK, as mayor of Los Angeles. 152 And in the 1930s, even after enthusiasm for the KKK and to subside, the KKK still remained active in Los Angeles and the surrounding community, with rallies attended by thousands of people and cross burnings. 153 1939, the KKK ceremoniously marched through downtown Los Angeles burning crosses in full view of thousands of people. 154 Los Angeles, the KKK was active throughout Southern California, including in Orange County, Riverside, and San Diego. 155 By 1923, the KKK had almost 900 members, 156 out of a total city population of about 6,000. 57 Its members generally held more prestigious jobs than the rest of the white population and were politically and civically active. 158 The Anaheim KKK burned crosses and held rallies drawing thousands of people. 59 One such event, an initiation in July 1924, attracted 20,000 people and included a parade of Klansmen with a marching band, airplanes, and fireworks. 60 By spring 1924, the KKK dominated the Anaheim City Council, which had initiated a program to replace non-KKK city employees with its own members. And succeeded. 10 new policemen, out of 15, were members of the KKK. 161 5 of the town's first 8 mayors were Klansmen, as were 6 of the 10 councilmen who sat on Board of Trustees, half of the city's treasurers, half of the city's engineers, half of its city clerks, half of its city marshals, and 2/3 of its fire chiefs between 1924. The 1920s, Los Angeles Deputy Sheriff Nathan Baker regularly recruited KKK members to the Los Angeles Police Department and was thought to be a member of the KKK himself. Half the treasurers, engineers, clerks, and marshals, and councilmen on Board of Trustees. Of the first 8 mayors, 2/3 of the fire chiefs, Klansmen in the town of Brea 1924-1936. 101. 3 Racial terror. 1936. 62 And in Fullerton, from 1918 to 1930, 7 of 18 city councilmen were Klansmen. 163. Side KKK were successful recruiters, claiming over 2,000 members in the 1920s. 64 In Riverside, the KKK held mass events that attracted thousands of people and included parades with marching bands, floats, and KKK members in full regalia. 65 The Riverside KKK prioritized policing interracial contact, which meant monitoring black residences' activities. 166 For example, the KKK was preoccupied with the city's 1922 settlement. The NAACP to desegregate a white-only pool. 167 In response, they targeted black swimmers with humiliation and violence. 168 The Riverside KKK gained political influence, and in 1927, helped elect a mayor, Edward M. who openly boasted about his support from the KKK. 169 In the 1930s, Riverside Sheriff Carl Rayburn openly sympathized with the KKK, and KIGY, meaning, Klan I Greet You, was painted on streets and sidewalks throughout the county. 170 The KKK's membership in Riverside decreased in the 1930s, but they still made appearances and burned crosses. 171 San Diego KKK, in the 1920s and 1930s, focused on using violence and other intimidating tactics to chase the wetbacks across the border. 172 The KKK in the 1930s also merged with other racist and fascist groups, such as the Silver Shirts League, that were focused on attacking African Americans, Latino Americans, and Jews. 73 The Ku Klux Klan in the Central Valley The Ku Klux Klan had an active presence in Fresno and Kern County. 74 As of 1922, a local Fresno newspaper reported over 240 alleged Klansmen in Fresno County, and the KKK held public events and parades with as many as 600 attendees during the early to mid-1920s. 75 The investigation in the aftermath of the Inglewood raid also revealed that a number of Fresno officials were KKK members. 176 Early 1920s, the KKK actively recruited in Kern County and developed what was considered the most violent KKK chapter in California. 177 In Kern County, in 1922 alone, there were over 100 cases of KKK violence, which included extrajudicial beatings, kidnappings, and tar and feathering. 78 In 1922, a local newspaper reported that several high-ranking officials in were associated with the KKK, including the deputy sheriff, the police chief, the board of supervisors chair, and a former assistant district attorney. 79 Although the KKK's influence started to decline in the 1930s, 180 white supremacist culture persisted in county in the decades that followed. 181 As recently as the 1960s, a sign across the Kern River between Oildale and Bakersfield read, "Nigger, don't let the sun set on you in Oildale." 82 There were also unconfirmed reports that a similar sign was spray-painted on the same bridge as recently as the late 1990s. 183 In 1981, 3 KKK members were arrested for burning a cross on the front lawn of a black family in the Kern County town of Boron, and KKK rallies were reported as recently as 1987. 184 In the early 1990s, black motorists were attacked on the streets of Oildale by whites hurling racial slurs and epithets. 185 In the 2000s, members of the white supremacist group the Peckerwoods were involved in multiple violent attacks against black, Hispanic, and Asian American residents that involved the use of racial slurs. 186 The Ku Klux Klan in Northern California and the Bay Area. Ku Klux Klan established a presence in the Bay Area during the 1920s. 87 By 1922, there were KKK chapters in San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. 188 In addition to burning crosses, KKK chapters in the Bay Area held rallies, initiation events, and public parades, which were attended by thousands. 89 In Oakland, the politically active KKK took control of the city government to create policy that would limit black home ownership, including by embracing restrictive covenants. 190 Between 1921 and 1924, the Oakland KKK grew to at least 2,000, and the chapter enjoyed political success well into the 1920s, winning an election for county sheriff in 1926 and city commissioner in 1927. 1991, the Oakland KKK also operated as a vigilante group, accompanying federal agents on prohibition raids. 192. 2000s, in the California Central Valley, members of the white supremacist group the Peckerwoods were involved in multiple violent attacks against Black, Hispanic, and Asian American residents that involved the use of racial slurs. 102. Racial terror. Forms of racial terror. Violent tools of social control. Racial terror has taken many forms throughout its long history. Although the primary component of racial terror is physical violence, perpetrators of racial terror have also destroyed and repossessed Black property. In the public nature of racial terror, overt action has often been unnecessary. Intimidation have often successfully kept African Americans from voting, living in certain neighborhoods, and exercising other civil rights. Scholar has argued, fear of physical death not only hinders the possibility of freedom, but also limits productive and meaningful living. As the oppressed submit to oppression and preserve biological life, they invariably suffer a degree of psychological and social death. 193. Construction onward, racial terror undermined African Americans' legal rights, with lasting social repercussions. Attacking African Americans who were never found guilty in a court of law, racial terror popularized the idea that Black people bear a presumption of guilt, contrary to the presumption of innocence, which the Supreme Court has described as foundation to our criminal law. 94. Many white lynch mobs killed Black criminal suspects who were later found to be innocent. 195. Some Black men were even lynched after a jury found them innocent of their alleged offense. 96. White people justified racial terror as a mode of self-defense against African Americans, as a tactic to deter future perpetrators, regardless of whether a crime had actually been committed. 197. This history of racial terror reinforced a view that African Americans were dangerous criminals who posed a threat to white society.